out that we want to change first before we move on to that. That's going to be relatable to kind of everything when it comes down to our gunplay. So what I mean by that is it's going to be related to physics materials. So for example, when we shoot, let's say we hit this door. Well, this door is wood. We would want, maybe a certain sound to play dedicated to, a shot hit around hitting wood. And same thing, we would want like a little bit of wooden splatter, or maybe even a certain decal to be placed wherever the bullet was hit that corresponds to the wood that was hit. Same thing with the concrete. Same thing with this concrete floor. Same thing with the mud outside, and that sort of thing. And that's all going to be done through physics materials. And that's also going to be what kind of controls the sound that plays when we're walking. So, for example, we would have a certain sound for when we're walking on this tile. We would have a separate sound for, even though we're not going to be going outside on this map, but one for just kind of like a muddy, sloshy, wet dirt sound, and one for this rubble. So that's what we're going to be working on. I'm going to be setting ourselves up in our door, anyways, to kind of work with this, so to speak, if that makes sense. So I'm going to head back to the map one, and here we have our first door. So let's go to the blueprint version of our barricade. And if we look over here, our collision mesh, well, we set this to be not visible. I'm just going to show it. Currently, we're using this as our collision for our actual navigation mesh. So if I click on our collision mesh and I move it up so it's out of the way, you know, the navigation mesh updates based on that, not on our door. And that's something, as far as I know, we're gonna kind of have to need because the door is a skeletal mesh. But we are also using this little what do you call it? This little cube that we scaled up as part of our interaction. So if I walk up and I press F, well, it's only controlling kind of this portion, the cube. And our door itself doesn't have any sort of collision or anything like that. I want So if we go to actually do like a line trace to get the physics asset of the door, like to return wood, it's going to hit this cube instead of the door. So we want to kind of swap them, but still keep the cube here for our navigation mesh. So we can go ahead and begin on this. I'm going to, screw it, I'll just leave it up. One thing I want to point out, let's go back to our door and open up the physics asset of the door. So by default, you're probably going to have a big cylinder here. So in order to change this, you would just right click on the root, add shape, add a box. It's going to be massive. Just click it and scale that sucker down till it fits the door, roughly like this one. I kind of want to crunch that in a little smaller, but it's, good enough. It doesn't really matter all that much. Well, actually, I want to go ahead and take the time and just do that real quick. Just nudge it down and nudge it up. Okay. Now can I scale that any smaller? All right, I guess that's the smallest that it'll actually go in that aspect. So you can save it and close it. So now that we have a decent, physics asset for the door, we can go ahead and then set it up. So I'm going to disable the collision for this collision mesh just for now by changing it to block all dynamic to no collision. So now we should walk right through, just like so. So that's working. Now what I'm going to do, well, the other problem is it also removed our navigation mesh settings, but we will fix that here in a second. Let's go ahead and set up our actual doors collision. So if we scroll down to collision preset, no collision. I'm going to set this to custom. And by default, it's usually set to all block all, but we're honestly going to leave it entirely like that. So just have it actually block all. So I want to change it from custom to block all dynamic. And as you can see, it changed the collision enabled type. So now we should be completely blocked, which we are by using the physics asset. You can see as well, we have that option to buy the door. So I press F. This part still has no collision, but this door does. And the zombies are not walking around it or anything because it's not updating the navigation mesh for the physics asset. Again, that's why we need this little guy, our cube, to block it for us. So now let's set up the actual collision for this so it blocks it. So for the example, let me select the block or the cube, scroll down to collision, I want to set it to custom, and collision enabled is going to be query and physics. Right? So actually we can probably simplify this. No, query only, and it should allow pretty much just stuff to go kind of through it, so to speak. But the thing is, we don't need it to block everything. So we want it to only block certain things. So if we hit ignore, so all the collisions are ignored, then we can just go to pawn or vehicle and block it. And since we're not going to have any vehicles in the game, it doesn't matter. But what's important is it updates the navigation mesh. Same thing can be done with the pawn. So if we set it to the pawn, it's going to block the pawn from going through. So for example, I'm going to disable the collision for my door. Just set this to pawn. The only thing that it blocks is the pawn. I don't get any sort of interaction notice or anything like that with my line trace. It just blocks ourselves. Now let's change that back to block all dynamic. Or I didn't mean to close the blueprint. So we're just going to leave it set as vehicle only for our cube. So ignore all, vehicle, block. File and save. And it should be updated here, which it is. And now let's press play. We have the option to buy it. We're blocked, but not by the cube. I press F. I can now walk through the cube, but the door still has collisions. So I press it again, it's just going to keep doing that. So we're going to have to eventually disable the door or disable its collisions entirely after using it. But this will allow us to get the physics asset of this door, which is wood, in the future whenever we shoot it. Because, like I said, we're not using the cube as our way of interaction. The cube would have blocked our line trace for the shot. So now I'm simply going to re-hide this, so uncheck visible, test it, and we are good to go. So now that that's just something important and it's out of the way, I will see you in the next one where we continue with, I think, zones.